Alright guys, it's just after 6 o'clock. I think it's time we get started here. So with that, let's start the show. Okay guys, welcome. This is episode 5 of Crit the Bootshine. This is my bi-weekly podcast that I started God knows when, long ago. But I've kicked it back off, revitalized it, revived it for what you might call a season 2 of 5 episodes. On Crit the Bootshine, I tried to give a microphone to all the topics that pertain to endgame and endgame players' interests, and discuss them in a way that maybe doesn't get talked about as much as some people might like. I think today's episode is going to be a lot of fun. It's probably one that, if you know me, has been a long time coming. So I'm looking a lot forward to it. I'm Layla Bell. I've been playing the game since the beta for Realm Reborn and a little bit in 1.0, if you're unfamiliar with me. And I've been raiding in it for all of the content patches that have been released thus far. So, with all the introductions aside, I just want to jump right into the show. Today's episode is going to be all about light party content, and that's an odd topic because this is sort of an endgame related show, and for I would say the large majority, if not all, of Final Fantasy XIV's history, light party has not been part of the endgame, and that's going to be something that we're going to talk about. Like, is that actually a good thing? The light party is so, dare we say, irrelevant to the game's endgame. It's something that has existed in the game since its inception, and in many ways maybe been shoved to the side and gone underutilized in certain patches. And we'll look at some of maybe the effects on that, or effects of that on the game, and is that really a good thing for the game going forward? I'll preface the episode by saying I'm going to argue no. So that's how we actually have a show. But yeah, I guess if you're kind of new to Final Fantasy XIV, this show is all inclusive. So welcome. I will detail for you exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about light party content. Light party content is basically anything that is not that is a group of players, but not enough players to be a full party of 8. So this is content typically geared towards four players in a party. And if you think about Final Fantasy XIV, what is that? I'd say for the most of it, that's been your 4-man light party roulettes. You do your expert every day or maybe a couple times a week to cap your tomes. We get a couple dungeons every patch that sort of allow you to do so. But beyond that, what is it? We have Square Enix introducing things like Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High to sort of expand upon the small man content atmosphere and try to give people content that doesn't require a full party to do. But why is it that people don't have such a warm reception to those things? Why do people sort of dread having to run their roulettes and dread having to grind Palace of the Dead for levels or clear Palace of the Dead for achievements, or those little glamour earrings that they had? Why is it that those aren't more well received? And a lot of what happens there is there's just a big either lack of incentive or such a large time investment required to enjoy them that people just start to lose focus on it. It doesn't become something that they want to do. It's something that they actually try to go out of their way to and avoid doing, and that's kind of a shame. So, what is a light party? It's for the purpose of tonight's show, we're going to be talking about specifically parties of 4, content based around parties of 4, and its place in the end game, or rather lack thereof. I want to segue this into the specific topic of dungeons and dungeons' existence in Final Fantasy XIV, because the existence of dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV right now is sort of at odds with what the standard MMO is all about, and that's not entirely Light Party's fault. It's also partially I get what we'll call a full party content's fault. You know, the 8-player content's fault. Dungeon crawling, if you have a wide familiarity with the history of MMOs, dungeon crawling is really the pinnacle of every fantasy MMO, and this is Final Fantasy XIV is the exception to that. It feels like, because what they've done, what they've gravitated towards with their endgame content is a full focus on 8-man parties for things like extreme primals and raids, and both of those styles of content very much so lack the experience of the crawling when you think about dungeon crawling, and that's what I was getting at when I was prefacing that this isn't entirely Light Party's fault. This is also due to the fact of how they've chosen to design raids and you know, their extreme primals. You queue up for a duty, or you zone into a duty, whichever they prefer or design for at that point, and you're at this point in the game you're just zoning in front of a boss. There's no traveling to get to the boss. There's no crawling whatsoever. There's no struggle to reach said boss. You just queue in, the boss is in front of you, you pull it, you fight it, you zone out, you do the next run step on the ladder. And it's just a rinse repeat until all of your endgame content is done. And that's really what Final Fantasy XIV has been in its endgame since early stages of Heavensward. I think that they got away from something that was coexisting with you know, the dungeon crawl aspect of a fantasy MMO. I think that they had a better grip on that in Realm Reborn, the game's vanilla re-release. And for whatever reason, you know, this isn't probably the show to talk about it. For whatever reason, they've just gravitated away from that, and we've sort of lost that feel. We've lost that experience of traveling through a dungeon or a raid with a group of friends and struggling to reach a finish line or final boss at the end of it. And I think that that's kind of a shame, because when you think of like really positively remembered fantasy MMOs just over the last 2 decades, that's typically like the one thing that I have the most fond memories of, is that dungeon crawl experience. I think of EverQuest, I think of games like Dark Age of Camelot, I think of you know, even more popular titles like well, I shouldn't say popular, but maybe a bit more modern titles like Terra or World of Warcraft. All of those games that I just mentioned have that sort of dungeon crawl environment that Final Fantasy has sort of lacked for the last 2 expansions. So I think that Light Party content can fill that void that's missing there, and probably should, to sort of give the atmosphere, give any atmosphere whatsoever to the MMO that we're playing right now. We need to think about sort of the content formula up to this point, though, to sort of assess like how Light Party content fits into the game. We need to look at the content formula, and that's what we'll start with right now. So typically, what's been happening for the past 2.5 expansions, I'd say. I'm going to turn on music just a little bit. It's hard to hear myself talk. What's been happening for the last 2.5 expansions, I would say, is we have the raids and extreme primals released. We get an extreme primal every patch, and we get typically 1 to 2 expert dungeons released with a new patch. And what that dungeon eventually devolves into is we run it for our expert roulette once a day, and you reach a point in a patch cycle where you no longer want tomes, and you no longer have any desire to run that dungeon whatsoever. Fast forward all the way to Stormblood with the introduction of things like Eureka, where people are capping tomes without ever setting foot inside an expert let all week. I would wager a guess that there's a large percentage of the player base that doesn't even run the new dungeons that are released right now. I think when I message people in FC chat, like, hey, want to queue up for an expert real quick? People just say, LOL, why would you do that? Just cap in Eureka. So the current system for dungeons is not very rewarding for the dungeons. They are not getting much playtime right now. And that's pretty sad, because I think a lot of time goes into the development of these dungeons, the dungeons environments, the atmosphere, the ambience that goes into them, the little bit of lore background that goes into the dungeons that they select, and all that is kind of largely being ignored by, I would say, a good percentage of the player base, just because there's no incentive for them to pay attention to those dungeons. We talked a little bit earlier about how they've sort of tried to answer the desire for small man content in Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High. What has been the problem with those? Why do people detest? Well, I shouldn't say everyone detests them, but why do a large percentage of the players detest things like Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High? I would argue that the thing that most turns players off regarding that style of content is the large time investment required in order to reach the fulfillment. So yes, you can pause in between your climbs in Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High. You can save your progress, and you can take breaks and return to it at a later time. But the fulfillment for that content is at the end. It's at the top floor. And in order to get there, for Palace of the Dead, it was much longer than Heaven on High. But when you're thinking about Palace of the Dead, you're thinking about a day's work, and Heaven on High, close to. So that's a very large time investment for, to reach the fulfillment found at the finish line. And I think that can't be the only option for somebody wanting to just enjoy content with a smaller group of players, because I think that a lot of players just want to log on and just play with their friends that are currently online, which you can't necessarily always do with a raid. You log on and maybe you can do it with an Extreme Primal. You can get 3 to 4 players together and go into Party Finder and fill up your Extreme Primal party. But for a raid, it's a bit more selective, I would argue, and you're going to spend quite a bit of your time waiting when it is not an uncommon scenario. It's actually quite common where you just have 3 to 4 friends online and you just want to play and have fun. 8-man content doesn't cater to that smaller group of players at all in that regard. You're unable to just kind of log on and just play with friends unless you're really, really interested in just doing maps, which I'm not really too sure how many people wake up and get out of bed and look forward to the prospect of running maps. They're lucrative, but are they enjoyable? I'm not so sure. So in the first part of today's episode, this episode is going to be 2 parts, like I prefaced a little bit before the show started. We're going to be looking at what is Light Party, does it have, why is its place in Final Fantasy XIV important? And that'll be the focus of the first part of our show today. And the second part of the show will be a bit more specialized. Second part of the show, we're going to specifically look at the topic of dungeon speedrunning as an avenue for Light Party content. But I definitely want to separate the two because I think the first part is very important and everyone can get behind it. And the second part will be sort of, my love letter to Light Party content and showing you guys why somebody like myself is able to enjoy something like that, and maybe that makes somebody watching able to enjoy it as much as I do. But we definitely cannot talk about that without first focusing on the importance of Light Party content in the game. And the number one thing that discredits the purpose of Light Party content in Final Fantasy XIV right now, and why it is so much of a larger amount of importance in other games, is the comparative lack of incentive to do it in 14. There is very little incentive to actually be doing these dungeons, or to be doing Palace of the Dead outside of leveling, or to be doing Heaven on High outside of leveling. And this to me has ever since 2.0, has been the thing that either got people to queue up or got people to not want to queue up. So I've been interested in light party content since 2.0, and I remember a time way back then in 2.0 and 2.1 where it was much more popular to be invested in light party content than it is now. And I asked myself, why? Why was it way more popular back then than now? And the thing that comes to mind most prominently is the reward was just better back then in terms of your time investment and what you got out of it. I think some of it had to do with the economy. Tome mats sold for were much more lucrative back then than they are these days. Running Wanderer's Palace and Amdapor Keep a number of times to cap your tomes was a pretty lucrative session for a player. Like that was very incentivizing to log on and want to do that. You got a big profit out of it, and profit is definitely one way to incentivize players. Speaking specifically for a smaller group of players back then, we had groups that formed a competition in light party content. The raid scene had not evolved to the extent that it has today. So you'd have these dungeon battles between groups of who can run a dungeon fastest. It eventually evolved into dungeon speedrunning later on, and that was their incentive for wanting to do it. I would say the concept of both pride and profit is something that is lessened over time, and there is just a clear decline in incentive to want to run this style of content, and that's a big problem. And that's the number one problem that they have to fix before they do anything. Before they can actually design, before they even think about designing what would be light party content that would be really challenging, or what would be light party content that would be really fun to do for players. Before they can even think about any of that stuff, they have to think about the incentive. What is going to make people want to do it? And there's a couple different ways they could do it. You can have, like we talked about, you can have an incentive of currency. You can have an incentive of leaderboards. There's various different avenues they could take. And I don't think any one of them is more right than the other, but there has to be something there. I'm personally a big proponent of currency being a big incentive, and this doesn't have to be gil. This can be anything, and it can be tiered currency based on performance. That's something we can talk about later in the show, but there has to be something there. I think the other issue that we have in Final Fantasy XIV with sort of on the side, separate from the incentive to actually do content, is the current linearity of character progression in the game. So, as you guys know, if you guys play frequently today, full party content is really the only endgame. And when we talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the show with extreme primals and savage raids, but what does that mean for a player's character progression? So you're a raider, you're raiding Savage, you're clearing Savage every week, you're acquiring gear for what? To use it where? Where are we using this gear? Is this gear's only purpose to be there to help you on the next raid? I would say that who you ask, you're going to get a different answer based on who you ask. If you ask the top 1% of the hardcore player base, their answer is going to be, I raid Savage so that I can progress my character and get gear so that I can attempt ultimate encounters. And if you ask really anybody else other than that top 1 to 2% of progression raiders, they're going to kind of struggle to give you an answer that doesn't sound silly when it comes out of their mouth. what is the purpose of progressing our character when the only purpose is to have gear for the next raid, which then gets you gear that you don't really have anything to use on unless you're attempting ultimates until the next raid. It's a very awkward state to be in when we don't have any other form of character progression. There's no side progression that we can that happens here where we can take gear from one pathway and use it in another pathway to progress our character differently. And that's something that I think works very well in other games. And what could happen is if you have character progression through not only full party content but also light party content, you're able to use the gear that's progressing your character in one area and have the ability to use it to affect your character's progression in another area. And that is something that the game completely lacks right now. And to me, this was like the biggest when I was coming up with today's show notes and like stuff that I would want to talk about when I'm highlighting the problem that Light Party faces right now in Final Fantasy XIV, PvE Light Party that is. It's this. The character progression is so linear and so top heavy within Savage Raiding that there is no purpose of existence for anything else. If we had a ulterior mode of character progression through something that wasn't a full party raid, you would be able to utilize both styles of progression to aid the other. And it would be a much more fulfilling experience, in my opinion. It's obviously a very opinionated statement. I feel it would be a much more fulfilling experience, and also something that would feel like something that would give you additional things to work toward and that you can work toward. And that's going to give players more interest in continuing to play the game as a patch goes on. So it's a very lacking dynamic right now that it just feels like it's incomplete almost. And it's felt like this since like I mentioned, since it started to first decline in Realm Reborn, around like that 2.2, 2.3 timeline. It's felt incomplete since then. If you're not a top 1 or 2% progression raider, character progression just feels incomplete. What Light Party needs to survive and create and sort of fill that void and complete the dynamic is we need that everlasting incentive that we talked about. And that can be through either leaderboards or currencies or whatever. There are so many different ways they can do it. We'll highlight a few of them later in the second part of the show. But the one thing that I want to emphasize, and I really want to make this point clear, because whenever we're talking about light parties and dungeons, the most common topic that gets brought up is Final Fantasy XIV needs a Mythic Plus system. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry you've been living under a MMO rock, but I'm going to help you out from that rock. Mythic Plus is a dungeon system in World of Warcraft that is sort of an endless climb of small party-based content. It's difficulty that has an endless difficulty climb, where dungeons are tuned based on the level of difficulty that you can select. Well, not select, but for the purpose of explaining it, the level of difficulty you select before zoning in. And that difficulty has no limit. It goes as high as you can clear. There are pseudo limits based on limitations of classes, so it is unlikely that we'll see a plus 40 keystone anytime soon, but theoretically it is an endlessly high ceiling of difficulty. And we don't necessarily need that in Final Fantasy XIV to fill the void in the dynamic that I'm talking about. Firstly, something like that would take an entire expansion to design. And when we're trying to solve a problem of lack of an incomplete content, we don't want to wait an entire expansion to do so. We can utilize already existing systems that have existed in Final Fantasy 14 since even 1.0. These things have been here since 1.0 and have gone underutilized. And this is things like the concept of the duty timer, the duty timer's relation to the content that you're doing. I think this segues a bit more into the topic of dungeon speedrunning, but this is an example of utilizing a system that's already there. And I think this segues perfectly into the second part of our show, which will take up probably the majority of our show, and that is specifically what I just mentioned, dungeon speedrunning. Is dungeon speedrunning the only avenue for light party content in 14? No. But I'm going to argue that it is a fantastic one. And I think that having its existence alongside things like Palace of the Dead, alongside things like Heaven on High, hell, even if we want to go smaller than light party, alongside the solo based content that's going to be coming out, we're going to have Blue Mage pretty soon in a couple weeks here. I could do an entire show on what they could do to solo content. This light party show today, but it's the same argument. There is a player base that it is an incomplete dynamic for right now, and the solo player is a part of that conversation as well. There's a lot of different ways they can take it. I think that dungeon speedrunning, and I think when people hear speedrunning, it has a sort of connotation to it, so I'm a little bit reluctant to call it that, but dungeon-based light party content that doesn't necessarily require a Mythic Plus style environment to be enjoyable. Content that we can take stuff that already exists and make it better and incentivize players to utilize it more, because right now, as we mentioned earlier, dungeons are dead content. They're content that gets glossed over by many players. We used the example earlier in the show. I don't even think that there are many people running the dungeons and roulettes right now because they can just cap in Eureka. So Square Enix releasing new dungeons, there's a large percentage of the players that just don't even try them. So when you're thinking about something like dungeon speedrunning and its place in Final Fantasy XIV, why is something like that good for the game? Or why could it be good for the game? Why could it fill a void that's missing? Does it have to be all FF logs? Does it have to be all, elitist EPing agendas? And it most certainly does not. And that's the purpose of bringing it up. It most certainly does not. I want to propose to you, this is just a fun sort of idea I threw down on paper that gives an example of something that could happen. This is a way that could incentivize sort of an alternative mode of character progression that doesn't negatively intrude on raid progression. So think about this fun idea for like a possible incentive for dungeon-based content. Take the duty timer in dungeons right now. Add tiered completion rewards. Think of it like this. They could even make it thematic with, say, how they do fate rewards. You have a bronze, silver, and gold based reward system, and I'll go even one step further. You have bronze, silver, gold, and let's say gold star. These types of tiers could be rewarded based on how fast you clear the dungeon, for example. Say you have a 90-minute duty timer. Say you clear it with, and I'm just going to use some loose numbers here just to get the point across. Say you clear it with 60 minutes remaining. 60 minutes or less. We'll say that. That may get you a bronze clear rate. From getting that bronze, maybe you get the base amount of tomes. You're a group that just came together in a party finder, or not a party finder, a duty finder. You got the base amount of tomes, but you know that if you do it 4 or 5 times that week, you'll cap. Okay. Now, say you clear it in that 90-minute duty timer. Say you clear it with, let's say, 16 minutes remaining. It's entirely dependent on a dungeon, and this is something that you see in other MMOs that sort of have a similar style of dungeon-based content. the threshold for the times required to complete the dungeon varies from dungeon to dungeon. But for the sake of argument, let's say you clear it with only 16 minutes have passed. Maybe that's enough to get you silver-based reward. What does silver get you? Well, it could get you a number of things. It could get you a bonus to tomes, so you're not just receiving the base reward, which is going to reward players by being able to cap sooner if that's all they want to do. Or what you can start doing is incentivize players further than that and start incorporating random little loot boxes that they're awarded. Say a silver reward grants you not only a tome, a set of tomes, and maybe a bonus to tomes, maybe it also gets you a materia loot box. You open up that loot box, you get an assortment of grade 5 materia with a chance of getting grade 6 materia. What if you clear the dungeon in 13 minutes or less? Maybe that's enough to get you gold. What's the reward incentive for receiving a gold reward? Well, let's say you get a large bonus of tomes, you get multiple materia loot boxes, and maybe those materia loot boxes also are guaranteed to have a grade 6 in them. Now, if you remember, I said that there was a fourth sort of tier to this kind of a paper reward system that we're having fun coming up with, and you could think of it as like a gold star, like gold +1, whatever you want to call it. In my head, I just picture like gold with a little star next to it in my fun little mock idea here. And what is that? What is this? Is it just you clear the dungeon in like 6 minutes flat, lightning speed, totally, inconceivable pace? No. What I am proposing is that there's actually a fourth tier that is rewarded to, say, the fastest clear of the week for that dungeon on your data center. You clear your dungeon, you get your reward screen at the end, you see you got a gold star. You're the fastest clear of that week. You're the fastest clear of that month, maybe. I think a week is probably a bit better. You're the fastest clear of that week. And every time that somebody clears that dungeon, they see your run. Say somebody got a silver. Say somebody got a gold. Say somebody was chasing gold star, but they got a gold. At the bottom of the little window that pops up, they see gold star time, 9:42. You go, wow, that's fast. How did they do that? I just got an 11:36. I wonder what they did to go that fast. And it gets you thinking, like, where could you have gone faster? How could you have done better in certain areas? Could you have maybe tried a different job? Did you take a paladin when you could have taken your warrior? It's something that not only incentivizes. And by the way, the gold star can also what we can also have it do would be, say, at the end of that week, whoever has the gold star ranking for that dungeon, let's give them a little reward. Give them I'd have to think about what exactly it could be. Maybe give them a minion box. Has a minion in it, a random minion from the game, something like that. So enough incentive to want to chase that top time. Could be a title. Could be glamour. I know that I think it was Heaven on High or Palace of the Dead. They had the primal weapons dropped from loot boxes and stuff. It could be a lot of stuff like that. Just glamour related or minion related or currency related. There's endless possibilities for how you can incentivize somebody based on a currency. But this goes like a little bit even beyond that. This solves an additional issue that happens in the game right now, and that's players' lack of desire to sort of better themselves or want to chase a carrot on the stick that isn't just a gear progression found in Savage rating. And chasing, something like that in a dungeon environment can be a lot of fun because it can bring people together. It can also, it could bring people apart too if it was a really toxic environment, but you can say that about anything. But I would argue that it's going to promote more teamwork than anything else, and it's also going to get people thinking about their performance, and that's always a good thing. This has been a touchy subject, I think, for Square Enix over the years. You know, the prospect of, say, like leaderboards, or even the other extreme of like DPS parsers being visible in game, letting people know like where their performance stands and could they have done better, could they have done worse, because they don't want people feeling belittled or badgered or bullied by those types of environments. And I think that what we're proposing right now, is a pretty not very intrusive thing to add to the game that doesn't, with the exception of maybe the self-realization of where a player can improve or not improve. There's not much belittling going on by looking at a time that's much faster than yours, or even much slower than yours. I think it's only positives, in my opinion. I think the negatives are present in every style of content, but I think that this one promotes also a lot of positives as well. And this is obviously just something we're just spitballing right now for the sake of our show, just because it's fun to think about. But I hope that gets people thinking about ways that they can incentivize this style of content. And you can do so in a way that doesn't sort of, only reward the 1%. The way Final Fantasy XIV works, say it was a title, for example. Say it was like a title that is dungeon specific. You get like Brave Flock's Bully as your title. I don't know. Please don't make fun of that. And say you get that for holding on to the gold star ranking for Brave Flock's hard mode at the end of a week, and you have until the end of a patch cycle to do so, before the release of new dungeons. There won't ever really be a time, as long as you're playing the game and capping your tomes every week. Even if you're not a Savage Raider, you're eventually going to catch up to Savage Raiders in eye level. And I think because of the way sands and oils work, maybe we want to extend this to be the next 2 patch cycles. But even non-raiders can eventually catch up to raiders in eye level and still be able to compete for like these top rankings, and these top based rewards, these rewards that are tied to top rankings. So I think what the players who are more cutting edge and more focused on that cutting edge content completion and getting their savage rating done as quickly as possible, getting their gears farmed as quickly as possible, all they would be gaining an upper hand on is the number of attempts that they have, the number of weeks that they have to attempt to get these either titles or rewards that are based on top rankings and stuff like that. So I think it works very well in the Final Fantasy XIV ecosystem, just because Final Fantasy XIV, compared to most MMOs, has a very lenient catch-up system. So yeah, I think that would be a really fun idea. Something that I would be like really down to see them explore. Concept of tiered based completion rewards. I think why this all has a great place in Final Fantasy XIV is, what does it give us? Giving dungeons that have incentivized rewards to players gives players an endless replayability that doesn't intrude on raid progression. The problem, I think, with replayability in raids right now is they really can only go like one of 3 ways. They can either have it be not replayable, which is how the game was for a long while. They can have it be replayable just for fun, which is currently what Stormblood is right now. You can re-clear bosses and raids for no reward other than parse runs or FF logs or speed runs. And the third way that they could do it is they could add sort of what we're promoting with dungeons. They could add that to raids, but I would argue that the barrier of entry, and I'm talking about the currency-based rewards right now, but I would argue that the barrier of entry for currency-based rewards in replayable raids would probably bring about more negatives than, say, the barrier of entry to 4-mans would. I think it's less of a barrier of entry to 4-mans. And that's also a topic that I'm going to get into in a second. The fact that the barrier of entry to 4-mans is much less so than the barrier of entry to raids. And it goes a bit, maybe in a direction you guys might not expect. I also like the concept of dungeons being a prominent source of endgame in Final Fantasy XIV because it's content that is sort of going to work for all types of players, because historically they don't really need to change much, and this is what I was talking about earlier. They don't need to add like a Mythic Plus system like they have in WoW. They don't need to add that to Final Fantasy, because specifically when it comes to dungeon speedrunning, you can have content be tuned for completion in terms of difficulty, which just means like have any assortment of players tune it so that as long as they try, their jobs can eventually complete the dungeon. The difficulty gets added, and what can make a dungeon be more difficult or less difficult, depending on what, how you're looking at this, is only added when you introduce speed into the equation. And what do I mean by this? I'm talking about you can have a dungeon that is tuned, that is completely clearable by. I'm gonna use some jobs that are kind of historically not super prominent in dungeon-based content, and that's gonna be the later years of Paladin. You can have a group that's like Paladin, Machinist, Red Mage, Ninja, and one of those jobs is actually really good. But just for moving on, you can have a group like that. The dungeon is tuned where they can complete it just fine. Now, if you took a Warrior, Black Mage, Summoner, and White Mage into that dungeon, you're gonna have a lot of ways that you can speed that dungeon up if you push the limits of those jobs that say that Paladin group maybe necessarily didn't have. And if you're listening to this and going, well, this kind of sounds really alienating, I don't think it's as alienating as people realize. And I'm actually going to argue in the next part of our show, I'm going to argue that it's less alienating than raiding. And if you don't have a problem with raiding, then you definitely shouldn't have a problem with this. So raids are tuned these days so that kind of like any assortment of jobs can eventually clear it. It's just that the proper assortment of jobs can clear it probably faster and in fewer pulls. Dungeons is sort of tuned where any assortment of jobs can clear it in one go, is because you can just get through the duty timer. What I think that is very nice about dungeons being a prominent source of endgame is that the things that make jobs either good or bad are much less binary than something that makes a job good or bad in a raid. I think for progression raiding, we'll view jobs that are good or bad based on two things. Number one, damage. That goes without saying. But number two, also their survivability. And I think those are two, and I don't just mean their survivability. I mean their contributions to your party's survivability. So in progression raiding, you have damage and you also have survivability. I would say post-progression, really the only topic of conversation, at least in Final Fantasy XIV's history, has been damage when it comes to raiding. When you're looking at a dungeon, there are extra variables that are added to the mix that help bring up those classes that are maybe that class that doesn't shine in a raid because its counterpart. Well, let's use Machinist as a prime example right now. The Machinist versus Bard debate is not much of a debate right now in the game. For reference right now, this is patch 4.4. If you're watching this in the future, or if you're watching this in the past, you're a wizard and stop watching my show. The number one thing that separates those jobs in raids is only their damage at that point. And I want you guys to envision what happens when you're going through a dungeon. Because of that dungeon crawl environment, you have extra variables that are contributing to what a job brings to your ability to complete that dungeon. One of those things is mobility. Mobility is something that in a raid, mobility either only contributes to your damage or your survivability. In a dungeon, your mobility also contributes toward your speed. It doesn't just have to be damage or survivability, it's also just your speed. Like it's very obvious when you think about it, but it's an extra variable that makes a class maybe a bit more desirable than it might in a raid. I'm going to use an example here, and we're actually going to get some visual representation of this in a moment. But I'm going to make the argument that there are more classes viable in dungeon-based content than there are classes viable in optimal raid environments right now. And it's because what makes something quote-unquote optimal in dungeon speedrunning is entirely up to your group's strategy. You know, you can sit here and argue that one strategy is more optimal than the other, but in my experience, there have been so many strategies that are so comparable in strength that a lot of it just comes down to user error or user talent. And because of that, because you have these numbers of strategies that are really strong and prominent, these different styles, like you can just brute force a dungeon with warrior, black mage, summoner, white mage, and just brute force the pulls, where you're just doing the maximum amount of damage in the shortest amount of time possible. Or you can have sort of a strategy that's based on the speed of your route and your ability to route around mobs, and that could be a party that I think, like we saw in the old days, Bard Dragoon. Bard Dragoon Warrior White Mage was a sort of speed-based party composition where you were utilizing out-of-combat Peloton. I think it was called Peloton back then. I actually can't remember. I know it's called Peloton now, but I can't remember what it was called back then. But you'd utilize out-of-combat Peloton to save your sprints, because back then sprint cost TP, and if you were spending TP, then you were a Swift Song. Thank you very much. You were hurting your DPS by using sprint. So a warrior that was sprinting in a black mage, summoner, white mage party was going to do less damage typically than a warrior who was not sprinting in a bard party, because they could potentially stay out of combat for longer and just ride Swift Song. Another really prominent example is what a ninja can do with Shikuchi. Being able to Shikuchi through a dungeon and using tools like Shadewalker to gather mobs so that you're gaining clear time by reducing the amount of time required to move through the dungeon and gather those mobs. Maybe the ninja will do slightly less damage than the black mage summoner party will to that pack of mobs, but you gathered them quicker and you moved from point A to point B quicker. Ninjas also can do crazy things like double Shikuchi, with proper target arrangement. There's just a lot of extra variables in that dungeon environment because there's more than just a boss's HP bar in front of you in the finish line. You have to travel through the dungeon. You have many different packs of mobs along your way in order to that you have to get through to do so. So there's just naturally going to be more variables, and those more variables are going to lead to more viable class compositions than there would be if it was just a boss's HP bar you were battling. And I picked out 2 VODs today that we're going to spend probably the remainder of our show going through that sort of highlight this and highlight maybe something that people wouldn't really expect when they thought of dungeon speedrunning. I think a lot of times when people think of dungeon speedrunning, they think of the party comp that I talked about earlier. And I know this because I've put together little dungeon speedrun events in the past, and this has been people's number one complaint. Oh, if you're not just doing, warrior, black mage, summoner, white mage, you're just at a disadvantage. And I could not disagree more, because that's just so not the case. I think the one problem we have with Final Fantasy XIV dungeons is that a job like Paladin is so infinitely inferior to a job like Warrior right now, and this just has to do with how Warrior is designed. This has less to do with dungeons. Warrior, something like a Warrior, and to a very lesser extent Dark Knight, it's very hard to argue for a Paladin over either of those two. I would argue that it's impossible to argue for a Paladin versus a Warrior with the introduction of a Warrior's ability to self-heal. I think maybe before you were able to spam ridiculous Steel Cyclone stealth healing, you could have made an argument for a Paladin to be, I wouldn't say as good as a Warrior, but at least maybe in the running for competition. But ever since the Steel Cyclone change, you can take a heal, you can take a no healer to a dungeon, and the Warrior can self-sustain just as good as a Paladin could self-sustain. So I think that's one issue that probably needs to be looked at in regards to dungeon dynamic. However, besides that, as far as DPS and healer compositions go, like the sky's the limit. There are so many viable strategy compositions that cater to various strategies depending on the strategy that you want to use. And we talked about how there's probably optimal strategies, but these strategies, one optimal strategy is not necessarily going to be optimal it might be optimal for one dungeon, but it's not going to be optimal for every dungeon. A lot of this is also dungeon dependent. And this is another variable that's not present. You have I guess the one-to-one comparison between raiding and dungeons would be that different strategies for different dungeons is typically your different strategies for different raid encounters. So that's pretty similar. But the existence of that variable exists in dungeons as well, is the important takeaway. So I want to sort of transition into something that is going to highlight all these different variables that you can find in dungeon speedrunning. And one of the things that you'll see is that, and this is a product of how they've designed raids recently, we don't get to utilize our full kits in raids. And this is probably because of to my understanding, it's because they don't want to force certain raid compositions on players to allow for completion. I think back to I'm going to use the example of Living Liquid and having a party with very limited CC options for the slimes. CC, ever since the days of Heavensward, has been something that is kind of MIA in raiding, and it's something that is ever so prominent in dungeons. And because of that, we get to utilize and experiment more of our kit in dungeons than we do currently in raids. And that's probably more of a problem with raids than it is a positive about dungeons. But that's just the dynamic right now. So in the current dynamic, you're finding the utilization of a larger toolkit in dungeons than you are in raids. And later on when we're thinking about what we want in Shadowbringers, maybe that's something that we want to look at as an adjustment to how that is in raids. Because personally, right now, when I am forced to run a dungeon on my warrior, not only am I worried about both stun and silence timings, but I'm also, having to balance that with everything that I would also be balancing in a raid. And you're going to see a lot of that in the VOD that I'm going to play here in a second. I've got two VODs for you guys, and we're going to watch through them. These are two different styles of dungeon speedruns. One is going to be, I purposely chose a sort of linear dungeon because this is another complaint people have with Final Fantasy XIV dungeons, that they're too linear. I picked a linear dungeon of the Burn, notorious for a large amount of linearity in it. And however, you're going to see, despite the linearity, it doesn't necessarily translate to simplicity, because there's a lot of cool things you can do in a dungeon like the Burn, despite its linear nature of walk forward, there's 2 packs and a boss. Walk forward, there's 2 packs and a boss. That doesn't limit complexity or simplicity. It just shifts it in a different direction, and we'll see that. And then the second VOD I have is something that sort of highlights the difference in class composition and how that can affect your experience in a dungeon. You can take a class composition that might be a bit weaker on the trash pulls, but maybe it does something very special to a boss that saves you a lot of time. And we'll see that in the Brayflox VOD that I have prepared. So I'm going to pull those up right now, and let's get into starting to watch those. And I'll mute them so we can talk over them as well. Okay, so I'm gonna let this VOD play out through its entirety, and the second VOD we'll just watch the ending. But this is and I'm gonna use, both of these are VODs from stuff that I did just because I already have them on hand. There's actually a lot of other VODs that of some really cool 4-man stuff. Specifically, shout out Rien for a lot of cool 4-man stuff that they were doing in Heavensward. And I wanted to get some of their clips on the show today, but I just ran out of time. But this is the speedrun that we did a couple weeks ago of the Burn, and the first thing that I want you guys to notice when you're looking at this is the party composition. This is very far removed from the, what some people who don't do a lot of dungeon speedrunning may view as a staple composition of warrior white mage. I think that's like the biggest argument against dungeon speedrunning right now is that if you don't have warrior white mage, you're just not even competitive. And like I said, I just couldn't disagree more. I would say a class like a white mage or a class like a scholar or an astro is very dungeon dependent. For a white mage, you're going to have the ability to have on-demand stuns at multiple times throughout a pull. And what that's going to do is maybe that's going to stop a mob's threatening cast bar that would force one of your melee or tanks to disengage or lose uptime on their AoE. And because of the addition of 10 roll slots for cross-roll abilities now in Final Fantasy, it has sort of lessened the need for a white mage in competitive dungeon speedrunning. And you're going to see that throughout the dungeon. I'm going to highlight in a couple of these pulls coming up. These first two pulls are pretty straightforward, so there's not really much to talk about here. The only thing that I will say is that the utilization of Ninja is very strong here. I would say that one of Warrior's weakest strengths in dungeon speedrunning is their ability to gather mobs efficiently compared to, say, Paladin and Dark Knight. And what the Ninja can do is a Ninja can sort of make up for Warrior's sort of inefficiency at that through the use of Shikuchi and Shadewalker. And that's what you pretty much saw with those first two pulls. On one pull, you're having the Ninja Shikuchi and Shadewalker everything back to the Warrior, and on the second pull, you're having the Warrior spend a bit more time overpowering with everyone in the party using diversions and whatnot. So that's sort of the purpose of the Ninja on those early pulls, and it's really to complement one of the Warrior's weaknesses. As far as the healer goes here, what is the reason that you have a scholar here instead of, say, a white mage or an astro? And some of it is dungeon dependent, like we talked about. The white mage is going to be stronger in an environment where you need a lot of stuns and you need them frequently. This is a dungeon where typically the mobs are only living through one cast, so you can utilize I can't remember the names of the specific abilities, but you can utilize the stun and silence that both melees and tanks have to get you through the pull, to interrupt those casts and kill the mobs before you need to worry about a second set of casts, or third or fourth set of casts. And between say the Warrior and Ninja here, you have 2 stuns and 2 silences to do so. So what we'll be doing on these next couple pulls here as this boss is dying is we're going to be assigning specific mobs to the tank and specific mobs to the melee here to interrupt. And by doing so, what we gain is mobile damage that the Scholar can do that the White Mage can't do as efficiently. And because the burn, despite it being a very linear dungeon, it's a very there's a lot of travel time in this dungeon, so being able to do damage on the move is very important for the healer. And the Scholar is just going to excel at that more than the White Mage is going to. So right here, this Dreadnought that Sophia has targeted does probably the most annoying AoE of the pull, and it's the AoE that's going to displace your melees enough to the point where, and I'm going to pause it right here actually before we talk about this next pull. It's an AoE that's going to displace your melees away from the trash, away from uptime on the trash, and making sure that those AoEs are hitting every mob in that clump. So we'll have stuns and silences rotate on that Dreadnought to prevent the loss of AoE uptime, and it's not just a loss in melee uptime; it's a loss of AoE uptime. Because trash is all about AoE. It just all is. This pull here that I paused it for is very important because this is the part of the dungeon that the party composition that we chose really separates itself, or maybe not separates itself, but puts us in competition with some of the more high damaging comps. And this is because this next set of pulls is one of the more difficult ones to not only gather effectively, but also clump effectively. And the Ninja is going to speed up the process tenfold. No pun intended. So what Fold's going to be doing here in this clip, and if you watch him closely you can see it, hopefully the quality will be high enough, is he's going to start the pull off with a Shadewalker. And if you notice, we had everyone sprint except for Fold on the previous pull. And if you can see here, I don't know if my mouse shows up on the screen, but you can see here that Fold still has a sprint available for this pull, and that's by design. What he's going to be doing is he's going to be Shadewalkering the tank, and he's going to be doing a sprint, Shikuchi second wind, and the second wind is going to put a pack of mobs onto the tank here. Well, first of all, the Shikuchi, the aggro from the Shikuchi, the small threat potency gained by using Shikuchi from Shadewalker is going to clump the mobs and send them to the tank, and then he's going to Shikuchi to the next pack and use second wind to send that pack of mobs back to the tank. So the ninja here is doing 2 pulls in one that would have taken that would have been a bit of a nightmare for a warrior to sort of gather effectively, and it's definitely one of the strong suits of ninja in this dungeon. And little things like that, little tricks with Shadewalker or Shikuchis, when the rest of your team doesn't have sprint, utilizing sprint in one area and then utilizing mobility skills like Shikuchi when your sprints are on cooldown, stuff like that is going to make a dungeon like the Burn very efficient. And you'll watch this play out. So he has to get ahead here because he has to get all the mobs on him, and he's going to use the Shadewalker Shikuchi to send the mobs back on me. So right now what this does, because I haven't had to overpower, I'm able to build up my Storm's Eye, which is going to prepare me for the big IR coming up here, and get us fully prepared to just delete this pull. And this is not something that I would have been able to do had I had to have been forced to stop here to overpower or maybe equilibrium this pull and then have to put up a Storm's Eye on the next pull. It's much less efficient. So the second win from his Shadewalker sends them all back to me, and now the only thing we have to worry about is we have to worry about how these mobs are stacked. And this is sort of something that you'll have to worry about as a tank in dungeons, but the size of mobs' hitboxes is going to determine how you want to do a pull. It's going to determine where mobs need to be tanked, and this is something that's probably doesn't get highlighted enough when you're thinking about dungeon speedrunning. It's mob hitboxes and their interaction in the pull. So what my goal here is going to be is I'm going to try to, because the Doblin here, that's the big goblin there, because he has less HP than the others, I'm not going to be too worried about his position in the stack. And I know that the little goblins here are all going to get deleted. So my goal here is to make sure that the little goblins surround the bigger, chunkier HP mobs so that while we're AoEing the bigger, chunkier HP mobs, those goblins will eventually die off, and then that'll allow the bigger goblin to move in. And this is just it's just something you have to practice. The ability to get mobs in position the perfect way that you want, and it just takes a lot of practice as a tank. I think this took me a number of tries to be able to do effectively. So what'll happen is these small goblins will get deleted, and then if the bigger goblin isn't dead by then, it'll inch in and then be a part of the larger AoE. So it dies right before it inches in, but it would have inched in and then been a part of the larger AoE, and that's how you do that pull effectively. While that's all going on, there are 2 very important AoEs that are being stunned and silenced, and this is done without a white mage required, just because we now have the access to the 10 cross rolls. And even before we had 10 cross rolls, you would typically take either a stun or a silence to these dungeon speedruns at the cost of something else. But now there's just no excuse. You have these available. We should be able to utilize them. So the big Rhoda swing, I forget the name of it from the Dreadnought, but the 2 big AoEs from the Dreadnought and one of the AoEs from the bigger Goblin both get silenced to allow for the maximization of melee uptime in the middle of that pack. Making sure that the ninja can just stand in the middle of that pack and never have to move, so that he can be maximizing his AoE in that pack. Making sure that the warrior can do the same with decimates and whatnot. So that's sort of like the science behind how to do an effective trash pull in this dungeon. We haven't talked about how to effectively do bosses, and and the reason I haven't done that is because that's very much going to depend on your party composition. We'll highlight how to effectively do a boss with this party composition, and a lot of it really comes down to the IR timing. So the IR timing is what your team's going to play off of here. You're going to plan out your IRs ahead of time in the dungeons because you're only going to get a set amount of IRs, and you're going to want to choose where that IR is best used. And this is a 1 IR boss, so the trick and the chain that goes into the trick are going to be synced up with that IR, just because everything revolves around that IR for this boss. And what you'll find here is that because of that, it's actually the proper play for the ninja to hold his trick for a bit longer to sync it up with this IR, and maybe not do it earlier when he could have. But again, a lot of that is going to require you to sort of be fluid to the time frame that you're completing the dungeon in. You're going to have to be adopting, just like you would in a raid and like a boss kill time, you're going to have to be adapting your cooldown rotations to the dungeon time. and the time at which it takes you to get all the bosses dead. So with 2 bosses dead, we're moving on to the final set of pulls here, and these are probably the most threatening and require definitely the most use of CC. And this is where, if you were a team just wanting an easy run, this is where say a white mage might be most prominent, because it's going to handle all the stuns for you. However, through the use of the wide kits that we now have, we can gain benefit from the Scholar here, because if you saw the large distance we had to travel for this pull, the Scholar was able to get a lot of damage off while we were moving. And as long as the stuns and silences are landed here, we can afford to do something like this. So this is just, again, stressing the importance of utilizing CC toolkits that unfortunately just don't get utilized in raiding anymore, and I think it's really unfortunate. I want in 5.0 to see more inclusion of CC, because it's just something that just adds another variability, or adds another variable to how you approach a pull or a boss, or the complexity of such. So this will be, I'm going to pause right here. This is definitely the second trash pull that we should spend time looking at, because this is something that you're going to find in a lot of dungeons where you have lots of competing hitboxes, and how you approach AoEing these packs greatly determines the amount of damage you're going to do this pull. And some of that's going to have to do with target selection, some of that's going to have to do with tank positioning, and some of that's going to have to do with your CC and interrupts and such. So the 2 biggest offenders of this pack are obviously the 2 big Giga Worms. So what we're going to try to do here is we're going to put the Giga Worms on opposite sides of each other, and AoE off of the mobs that are in between them, to then cleave onto the bigger AoE hitbox, the bigger hitboxes of the Giga Worms on the side. If you don't do this, what will happen is, if you have the Giga Worms and their massive hitboxes side by side, they're going to push these smaller hitboxes out of the AoE picture, and you're not going to be able to hit everything. So mob positioning here is very important, and it just takes party practice to sort of, you're battling the engine of the game here, and understanding how to effectively move the mobs around in the pull. And this is a pull where that is of the utmost importance, and you'll see how it plays out here. So if done properly, 1 Giga Worm will be on one side of the pull, another Giga Worm will be on the other side of the pull. And we're going to be rotating interrupts on the AoEs where we can. I believe the strategy for this pull was to actually let 1 Giga Worm's AoE go off because we could live it, and make sure that we interrupt the other one, because there just aren't enough interrupts in our kits to be able to handle everything. So take one and live it, interrupt everything else, including a very threatening poison from the beetle mob there. So because of the way that the pull was orchestrated with the positioning of the mobs, that pack just melts. It's just one set of AoE rotation, and it just melts. And you just can't do that if the mobs with their giant hitboxes are right next to each other. And people I talk to about this dungeon, that's their biggest complaint, is the hitboxes are just so massive, it's impossible to do effective AoE. And it's not impossible, but it does take a lot more effort, because you have to get the mob positioning just right. I think as far as this boss goes, for like an end of dungeon boss, this boss is fairly straightforward. There's not a lot of cool manipulation you can do to the boss. It's just maximize your CD timings, get as much damage out of them as you can, and also play to the dungeon completion timer, making sure you're getting the most out of your timer. Obviously, you're going to have the 3 ads spawn for Mist Dragon, so just making sure you're not wasting any effective DPS here. I think when we were first starting this, we had a strategy of just limit breaking one of them, but there was a lot of damage wasted. It was a lot of overkill, so we decided against that. When you kill this ad here, you can't immediately attack the boss, otherwise it will get frozen. So what we'll do is, as soon as this AoE disappears, even though the boss still has the debuff on him, where you can't attack him, we can start channeling the LBs, so that during the channel of the LB, by the time the LB finishes casting, that debuff will be gone and we can start attacking. So cool little uptime trick here with the LB. Other than that, there's not a lot going on here that's interesting. I think defensively, as with most speedruns, you're going to be playing for as little GCD healing as possible, and in order to do that, you're just going to be utilizing your defensive abilities as much as you can. Things like APOC, things like feints, stuff like that. Just minimizing the amount of movement as well, just to maximize as much uptime as you can. So that sort of gives an example of how, even despite a dungeon being extremely linear, there's quite a bit of complexity and play that you can still have in that dungeon to honestly increase your time by minutes. And some of it has to do with your decision of party comp, and some of it just has to do with things like mod positioning. When we first started looking at the burn, our initial opinion was, well, it'll be a dungeon entirely based about maximizing our cooldown usage, and that'll be a good warm-up to maybe a more interesting dungeon. And by the time we finished running it, we thought, wow, there was actually a lot of stuff that we could do that really changed the way our pulls happened. And it's stuff that maybe isn't found in every other dungeon. Those massive hitboxes aren't found in every dungeon, and being able to properly deal with those massive hitboxes is something that you had to manipulate. So don't judge the book by its linear cover, I guess, is the best closing for the burn. There's a second dungeon I wanted to talk about, but we're just going to look at sort of the ending of that dungeon, because this is actually a Realm Reborn dungeon. But it's one of the best examples I have on video of a difference of party comp, and using potentially an unsuspecting party comp, gaining a massive speed boost in the dungeon over, say, the more in Realm Reborn, one of the most prominent AoE party compositions was a Bard Black Mage. And typically if you were speedrunning dungeons in Realm Reborn, you were defaulting Bard Black Mage, or Black Mage, or Black Mage Summoner, stuff like that. A bit less so Summoner, but this will be an example of taking a non-traditional comp and gaining a large advantage in speed from it, and large so much that if it was one of those little gold stars at the end of the week that we talked about earlier in the show, it would definitely leave people scratching their heads. And this is going to be our Braveflox hard mode run back 4 years ago, guys. This is 4 years ago. Realm Reborn abilities, but don't worry about the rotations abilities. That's not the purpose of showcasing this. It's the party composition and what a party composition can do to your clear time. So let's full screen this. What you're going to notice in the party composition here is that we don't have the traditional Black Mage, and instead we are running the pretty untraditional comp back then of Bard Dragoon, and it's for a very specific reason. It's specifically for this boss in front of us. If you are familiar with this dungeon and this boss, you'll know that this boss likes to jump away, and he has a lot of invulnerable phases that take up a ton of time. So our entire goal for this dungeon is to be at least somewhere in the ballpark of competition time, getting to the last boss, and then taking a class composition that can kill the boss an entire cycle quicker than some of the more AoE favored compositions can. So while we're losing time getting to this boss, we're going to make up so much time that it doesn't matter. And we'll see that play out, and the way it plays out is rather interesting, and this is definitely a speedrunner's wet dream right here. A dungeon speedrunner's wet dream, where we're going to be utilizing maximization of CDs, ability manipulation, and party composition to get through this. This is one of my favorite dungeons to speedrun back in the day. It was also one of the most popular ones for tomes back in the day. So what I want you guys to notice here is we've pulled the boss, yet you're going to see nobody in the party is really attacking. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be waiting until a very specific mechanic that's going to allow us the longest amount of animation lock, and then we're going to dump every single one of our cooldowns and burn him as low as possible in that long animation lock, so that we get him as low as we can for the next cycle, because we want him dead on the next cycle. We don't want this going 2 cycles, otherwise we lose too much time, and then we're just inferior compared to the AoE powerhouse party compositions attempting this dungeon. And the reason we're not attacking here, and the reason you don't see us just popping cooldowns right out of the gate, is we want to maximize the effectiveness of our cooldowns. So we're going to wait until we have a visual cue, and that cue is going to be a flamethrower, and he's going to phase at around, I think it's 70% or something, and we want to burn him to like 71 or 72% before the really long animation ability. And that's going to be, it's like a gob toss ability. I forget the exact name of it, but you'll be able to see it. It's going to target fold. So we're going to wait for a flamethrower, and then we're going to pop everything. So there's the flamethrower. There go the blood for bloods, the internal releases, and we're going to burn him. Watch the HP here. He was at 80%. So 81 was the push timing. The bombardment is the animation lock we were looking for. That's his longest animation lock ability. So at this point, it's just balls to the wall, burn him as low as he can before he teleports away. Because he phases at 80%. I think I said 70 earlier. He phases at 80. So we get him really low in that first cycle. We could have actually got him lower, but we got him to 26% in that first cycle. And this is with dungeon appropriate gear. This is not with like people coming back and attempting this in super high level gear. This is the best. This is the eye level gear that was attainable when the dungeon was released. And this is just the power of animation manipulation in dungeons and what you can do to bosses if you manipulate it hard enough. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be pairing a 26% HP burst. He's going to come out of this invulnerability and he's going to instantly want to phase because he's already pushed past his percentage point to do so. So we need to burn 26% before he instantly phases again. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to leave one of the bombs up here that's going to drop to prep our combos. And me as the Dragoon, I'm going to specifically be prepping a disembowel so that I can get the disembowel up for Fold's Bard and then go straight into my melee LB. And the purpose of the Dragoon is this right here. It was not only to get him as low as we can with the life surge burst at the beginning, but it was also for the purpose of having a braver, because this kill time here was not doable without a braver. So the last set of bombs comes down. We'll be prepping the heavy thrust, the disembowel, and the warrior will be refreshing his maim. Back then when Storm's Eye was maim. So everything is ready to go for a big 26% burst before he immediately phases again. Also, we have him, because of the way mobs work in this game, they have to reach their target before they queue an ability. So we mark where the warrior stands so that the boss has the longest travel time to reach him before he queues his phase change. So he's going to travel all across the room, giving us that extra GCD to damage him. The disembowel is up, you go straight into the braver. And he's executed before he phased. And that right there is a 640 clear time. I think that was over a minute faster than anyone attempting Brayflox speedruns back then. This just shows you that sometimes an unconventional comp can have a massive time save if you just got to know where to look for them. And you're only going to find those areas by constantly running the dungeons and seeing little things that you can tweak and just a lot of practice in doing so. And it's just, for me, as my love letter to this style of content, it's one of the most fun things I enjoy doing in the game. I have so much fun with it, just looking for those little avenues. So that sort of are like the two, I would say, some of the two most unique VODs I have to sort of display the various styles of dungeon speedrunning. You can have ones that favor mobility, you can have ones that favor burst, and then the more obvious ones that we're obviously not going to, we don't really need to showcase, are the ones that are just favor massive AoE. You pull the pulls as just brute force through the pulls, and they just die instantly because you have front loaded your group with so much AoE. And that's definitely a style that's applicable in some dungeons. I think where that's very applicable is in a dungeon like Hell's Lid. Hell's Lid has a lot of mobs that don't have a lot of, mechanical interaction, through like abilities that stun the party that need interrupting or paralyze the party that need interrupting. You don't have to worry too much about it. It's just pull the pull, live the damage, do the AoE. Hell's Lid does, Sophia is correct, Hell's Lid does have, and Hell's Lid is actually a bit of a poor example because the second boss does have a big skip that if you do, sort of similar to the Brayflox one that we just witnessed, with proper ability manipulation and animation locking, you can skip a phase of the second boss that's going to gain you a massive time save. And compositions that are able to do that are probably going to outperform compositions that can't. I think with Hell's Lid in particular, though, the big AoE composition actually could make that DPS check, so it's possible that comp just kind of reigns supreme in the end. But yeah, those are two, one very recent VOD and one very not recent VOD. So you got all sides of the spectrum there. I think that sort of covers like everything regarding specifically dungeon speedrunning. What did we talk about? We talked about Dungeon speedrunning having all sorts of unique variables that maybe you won't find in a raid that give merit to some jobs over others. Specifically, job mobilities I think is very important, and also job burst, which is also important in raids sometimes, but it's very phase specific. And I think it's probably a bit more prominent in dungeons than you might find in a raid. Like a dragoon's ability to life surge burst something, or a warrior's ability to IR burst something. I think back to fights like Manipulator, A4S, where stuff like that was really prominent. Turn 7 Savage was another one where that was really prominent, killing the pro sectors and as few GCDs as possible. There are definitely places in raids where burst matters quite a bit. I would argue that almost any dungeon burst is going to matter. So, the stock for those burst-based classes definitely rises in addition to the stock for those mobility-based classes. I need a sip of water. I've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes straight. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So, sort of stepping away from the specificity of dungeon speedrunning and its place in Final Fantasy XIV, it's something that I've fallen in love with over the years. I've been doing it since 2.0. This episode is my love letter to it. It's something I'll probably continue doing till I stop playing the game. And what it does is it gives myself endless replayability, and what Square Enix can do by simply adding an incentive such as leaderboards or currency, adding any incentive at all. It's a style of content that has a little enough barrier of entry and could have a powerful amount of rewards that's going to give people an ulterior style of progressing through the game and enjoying their time being logged in. A lot of our time spent being logged in right now, if you're wanting to do endgame, is spent either sitting in a duty finder or sitting in a party finder or waiting for your static to log on. One of those three things is probably how people spend their endgame right now. And it doesn't have to be that way. It is much easier to get 4 people together than it is to get 8 people together, and that's just always been the case. And it's infinitely easier to get either of those together than it is to get 24 mans together. So I will continue to preach for the necessity of a light party option in the game that has the replayability that, say, incentivized speedrunning does or incentivized completions do. I would love to see some sort of a weekly leaderboard for this style of content, like we talked about earlier. And I understand that maybe this isn't content for everyone, but it can certainly be content for many. And it's content that utilizes resources that already exist in their game, so it's very resource efficient for them. It's just adding on to something like the duty timer that already exists in the game. And this is something that they experimented with back in 1.0. A lot of people don't know this, but this is actually something that was experimented with in 1.0, and it did not go over well with the 1.0 player base part. And in my opinion, it did not go over well because of how 1.0 was actually designed. I think the gameplay aspects of 1.0 hindered it more than anything. Your ability to speed through a dungeon and utilize these various variables and take advantage of them was very much so limited by the game's engine back then. This is an entirely different game, and I really urge them to revisit the topic of duty timer based completion rewards or incentives, and because it's an entirely different game and it's an entirely different player base, honestly. So I think in closing, in regards to the topic, all players can kind of agree, and we said this at the beginning, but all players can kind of agree on one notion, and that's that when we log in the game, we just want to have stuff to do. And all this does is add more things to do at very little cost to them. And it's stuff that I think can only better the game and people's enjoyment of progressing their character. And if they want to go as far as WoW takes it, where they make this style of dungeon style content or light party content and a means of character loot progression, they could do that. I don't necessarily know if I would go that way right out of the gate, but theoretically you could have dungeons based on completion rate or time of completion, reward different eye level gear at the end, Maybe this gear doesn't match completely with what a Savage raid drops, but maybe it drops something 10 eye levels lower, but maybe it's a pink item so that the stats are RNG, and maybe the stats can get with enough blessed RNG, they can rival that of an item 10 eye levels higher for certain equipment slots. I think that opens a bit too much of a can of worms for them right out of the gate. I would probably first address the more prominent issues of just getting people to do dungeons more frequently by upping the incentives, because right now dungeons are being designed every patch and a large portion of the player base is honestly ignoring them. And that's a shame, because I am willing to assume that they put a lot of time into making these dungeons look nice and perform well. And when we're not even trying them, or a lot of people aren't trying them, what's the point? You're forced into doing one of them for your MSQ, you're forced into doing one of them to unlock your XP roulette, but beyond that, are you really doing them? I don't know. Some people are, some people aren't. Some of that's Eureka's fault, but topic for another show. I think that's really all that's written on my love letter to this style of content. So in closing, I hope that this speaks to you on a spiritual level as it spoke to me one summer night 5 years ago, sitting in Mordona, just wanting to run that Wanderer's Palace 2 minutes faster so I could get my tomes, my philosophy tomes, 2 minutes faster. And then realizing that all we had to do to open a gate was kill one little Tomberry and AoE sleep the rest. And from there it was history. So I think with that, I'm going to start closing up shop here. And I hope you guys enjoyed me rambling about light party stuff for the hour and a half that we talked. This was a delayed show by a week. As you guys may or may not have seen on Twitter, I will probably be doing I'll probably be keeping the static schedule of bi-week shows. So the next show that I'll do will probably be 2 weeks from now again. So you can start looking forward to that. And I think with that, I'm going to shift us to our final slide here, where I want all of you to get out of my face. We had a lot of fun today going through all the late party nerding out, and next episode will be a lot more nerding out, and I'm actually going to be bringing on a guest for next episode, because I think that this is something that we shouldn't just be listening to what I want in Shadowbringers. We should be listening to what everyone wants in Shadowbringers. Next episode will be January 4th, and the topic of that show will be the wish lists that we have for Shadowbringers, what we want to see in 5.0. So start thinking about that, because that episode will probably be heavy with chat interaction, because it'll be a bit easier to do so, having a guest on and everything. And I know what I want to see in 5.0. I want to hear what you guys want to see in 5.0. So start thinking about that and come back here in 2 weeks. Other than that, I had a lot of fun today. This will be posted on YouTube later. If you're watching this from YouTube, sup? This will also be put onto an audio file along with last week's episode, which is already posted onto an audio only stream. However, it's a bit longer than the episode actually is, so I need to truncate it a little bit, and I'm having trouble doing that. So once I get that sorted out, both of these will be up in their audio only distributions, and then I'll probably paste those in the YouTube and send them out on Twitter, so look for that. But I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys did too. Thanks for watching. I'm going to go douse myself in a water bottle because I'm parched. You guys have a good night, and see ya in 2 weeks. Peace.